So we're going to dive straight in because on Saturday, this happened. The head of Tanzania's electoral commission, a guy named Jacob Mwambengele, got in front of the cameras and announced that President Samia Suluhu Hassan had been re-elected. Which, okay. But then he read the number, 97.66 of the vote. That is 97.66. A figure so absolute. It feels less like a democratic result and more like the score you give yourself when you're grading your own homework. For context, imagine that big is almost unheard of in any real multi-party system. That's a number usually reserved for the entrenched authoritarians. You know, your Paul Kagames of the world. And yet, here it was, being presented as the will of the Tanzanian people. Pretty freaking weird. And look, this wasn't a victory. It was a foregone conclusion. This was a coronation with extra steps. Because while that official announcement was being made, the streets of Dar es Salaam weren't exactly filled with champagne and confetti. They were tense, scarred by days of fire and fury. Because millions saw the whole thing as a complete sham. And the government's response to their protest was, let's say, swift and brutal. We're talking tear gas, live ammunition, and then the classic move, shutting down the internet for the entire nation of around 67 million people to make sure nobody could see what exactly was happening. In the middle of all the chaos, the government claimed reports of hundreds killed was hugely exaggerated, which is just a weird thing to say. It's like setting a house on fire and then arguing with the fire department about the exact square footage of the blaze that you already began. The UN, the UK, Canada, and Norway all cited credible reports of numerous deaths and sounded the alarm. And the main opposition leader, Tundu Lissu, he wasn't at a campaign headquarters. He was in prison, charged with treason. His party and the largest opposition force in the country had been banned from the very election entirely. So, how did we get here? How did a country once seen as a stable spot in East Africa, a place that had seemed to be moving in the right direction, end up in this much of a crisis? And how did a president who came to power promising reform and reconciliation preside over the complete dismantling of her country's democracy? This is the unfortunate story of how an incumbent's hunger for power crushed a nation's future. This is the story of how Tanzania's democracy actually died. Welcome back to the Kenyan Week That Was. I'm your host, DY. Again, we say wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. To understand the tragedy of 2025, you have to go back to March 2021. The president at the time, John Magufuli, a guy nicknamed the Bulldozer, which you know tells you a lot about his management style, died in office. His tenure was marked by a complete crackdown on all almost civil liberties. He banned opposition rallies. He went after the media, and critics had a nasty habit of just disappearing. So his death sent shockwaves through the country. His successor was his vice president, a quiet figure named Samia Suluhu Hassan. And her becoming president was historic. She was Tanzania's first female head of state. But more than that, for a minute there, it felt like a genuine hope or a moment of hope. A wave of cautious optimism swept the country because here was a leader who seemed like the total opposite of her predecessor. Her whole vibe was softer, more consultative. She started talking about the 4 R's. You know, the reconciliation, resilience, reform, and rebuilding. And for a time, it seemed like she meant it. She released some political prisoners. She started talking to the opposition. Crucially, she lifted the ban on political rallies that had been in place since 2016. She even unbanned some media outlets. It felt like a new dawn. Everyone started calling her Mama Samia. And the hope was that she would be the reformer who would steer the ship back towards democracy. But And there's always a but in these stories. A ship of state has a lot of old, rusty parts. The ruling party, the CCM, has been in power since Tanzania's independence in 1961. It's a party that is basically fused with the state itself, the security forces, the government jobs, everything and anything Tanzania. And while Hassan was the new captain, the old crew from the bulldozer era was still on board, and they were not interested in changing course. They were interested in keeping their power. So, as that initial honeymoon period wore off, it became abundantly clear that the president had a choice, either to push for reform and risk war inside her own party, or consolidate her power using the party's old playbook. The first signs were subtle. The promised constitutional reforms that the opposition said were vital for a free and fair election got slow walked into meaninglessness. Activists who tried to test the limits of the new freedom found themselves under investigation. The language was still about reconciliation, but the actions started telling a completely different story. The false dawn was over, and behind that reformist facade, the old machinery of repression was getting tuned up for a new and arguably more brutal face. The road from reformer to autocrat is usually a marathon of 1,000 little cuts. And for Tanzania, that process sped up dramatically in the 2 years preceding the 2025 election. It turns out there's a classic playbook for this sort of thing, and President Hassan's government proved to be very, very good students of this very playbook. First, you capture the referee. The opposition and the civil society groups had one main demand: an independent electoral commission that everybody could trust. What they got in 2024 was some new electoral laws that the government called reforms, but which were basically the opposite. They were a masterpiece of political engineering. You create an appearance of reform while actually making sure the president still controls who gets appointed to the same commission. It's like letting one team hire the referee and then acting shocked when all the calls go their way. The system was already rigged to favor the ruling party, but was just given a new coat of paint. Secondly, you silence the critics. With the electoral machinery now firmly in your pocket, the next step is to make sure that no one can point out the game is fixed. This is where things got terrifying. A wave of arrests and abductions targeting opposition figures, activists, and journalists began to escalate. Human Rights Watch had been documenting this for years, but by June 2025, a UN panel of experts said they were alarmed by a clear pattern of repression. The government's response was just to deny everything, with police even suggesting some people had staged their very own abductions. But the fear was very, very real. One of the most high-profile cases was a former ruling party insider who became a critic of the president. He was abducted from his home by unidentified men, which sends a pretty clear message. If one of our own isn't safe, what chance do you think you have? As Amnesty researcher put it, the abductions are to cause a wave of fear. It should worry everyone. Then, the state weaponized the law itself. Vague cybercrime laws were used to prosecute anyone who published anything false or critical of the government online. This was not just about controlling the story. It was about making people so afraid to speak that they actually censor themselves. Third, and this is a masterstroke, you create a crisis to justify getting rid of your biggest opponent. The main opposition party, Chadema, frustrated with the fake reforms, started a no reforms, no election campaign. As part of this, they refused to sign a new mandatory electoral code of conduct in April 2025, arguing that signing it would legitimize a process they already knew was rigged. The government seized this. The Electoral Commission, the same one they controlled, announced that any party that didn't sign the code would be banned from the election. Chadema stood its ground. And just like that, in April 2025, the largest opposition party in Tanzania was officially banned from the election. You present your opponent with a choice either to legitimize your own oppression or be removed from the game completely. When they refuse to play, you use your principled stand as a legal excuse to actually disqualify them. The path to 98% victory was now widely open. And look, this kind of slow motion dismantling of democracy is happening all over the world. And it's often complicated and underreported. So if you believe these stories are important and you want us to keep bringing them to light, you know what to do. Take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit that like, and actually hit the notification bell. Your support really does help. Now, back to the final act before the election. With the rules rigged and the critics scared, it was time for the final blow. Taking the other team's best players off the field for good. The number one target was Tundu Lissu, a charismatic and frankly incredibly brave critic of the government. This is a man who had already survived a horrific assassination attempt in 2017, where he was shot 16 times. After years in exile for the medical treatment, he returned to Tanzania and became the leader of the main opposition party, Chadema. He was the face of the no reforms, no election movement. The state clearly saw him as the single biggest threat to their plan. So, what did they do? In April 2025, they arrested him. And the charge? Treason. The most serious political crime anyone can be accused of. A charge that conveniently makes you ineligible for bail in Tanzania. His lawyers from all over East Africa and the world over immediately said the charges were a sham designed to actually silence him. And then you'll be shocked to hear his trial was strategically postponed until after the election. It's so laughably weak. It's like if your opponent in a chess match just before you're about to checkmate them has you arrested for treason against the chessboard and locks you in a closet until the tournament is actually over. And they weren't done. They detained Lissu's deputy. Other party officials were beaten and arrested. The message couldn't be clearer. Being an opposition leader was now a complete crime. With Chadema now leaderless and officially banned, you might think the job was done. Oh, but there was still the second largest opposition party, the ACT-Wazalendo. The presidential hopeful Luhaga Mpina was also set to run, but the now fully weaponized Electoral Commission simply disqualified him, citing some procedural issue. Yeah, that's all it took. Think about that. Think about what that meant. The election had become a championship game where one team writes the rules, appoints the ref, and then has the other team's star players arrested and their backups disqualified on technicalities. The game is over before it even starts. President Hassan was now running against a handful of candidates from tiny parties nobody had ever actually heard of. The election had now become an official coronation. During all this, rights group was screaming about the wave of terror, but the big regional bodies that could have applied the pressure, like the African Union, were conspicuously silent. Their silence was basically a green light. As election day approached, a grim feeling settled over Tanzania. For millions, especially young people in the cities, this wasn't an election. It was a funeral for their hopes of a democratic future. And that combination of repression and frustration was about to explode. On October 29th, 2025, some Tanzanians went to the polls. The government would later claim a massive 87% turnout. But eyewitnesses on the ground, especially in opposition strongholds, said polling stations were weirdly and eerily quiet. What wasn't quiet were the streets, though. The anger that had been simmering for months just boiled over. This wasn't an organized protest. This was a spontaneous rage. Protesters blocked roads and set fires. Videos that got out before the internet was cut showed people chanting, "We do not want Mama." A total rejection of the president they felt had betrayed them. The state's response was immediate and absolutely merciless. The military was deployed to back up the police. They came ready for a fight. They fired tear gas, and according to credible reports from the UN, Amnesty, and others, live ammunition into the crowds. And then came the classic authoritarian power move. Kill the internet, plunge a country into an information blackout so no one can see what you're doing and protesters cannot continue to organize. In that darkness, the human cost is hard to verify, which is of course the point. The government has acknowledged almost nothing, but the UN said it had credible reports of at least 10 people killed. Amnesty International reported dozens killed, and the opposition party Chadema, gathering information from the people on the ground, made a shocking claim that around 700 people had sadly been killed since election day. Now, that number is disputed, but security source and a diplomat both told the AFP news agency that they were hearing reports of hundreds of deaths. The real number may never be known, but what's undeniable is that a lot of people were killed for protesting on election day. An election day, and for an election they actually saw as stolen. The international reaction was muted. The UN expressed deep concerns. Deep concerns. A few Western countries put out a joint statement, but there was no real consequences, no sanctions. And the regional African body that should have been screaming the loudest stayed silent completely, which sadly is a devastating failure. In her victory speech, President Hassan called for unity. This gets me every other time. Saying it's time to unite our country. For the families of those who are killed and the millions who had felt their future had been stolen, those words must have rung pretty hollow. It was a demand for submission, disguised as a plea for peace. The landslide had finally been secured. But the government's legitimacy was in shreds, and the country was left broken and bleeding. So, what does this all mean? A 98% election victory achieved by banning the opposition and shooting at the protesters isn't a mandate. It is a declaration of absolute power. For the 67 million people of Tanzania, the message from their state is now crystal clear. Meaningful opposition will not be tolerated. The dream of a more open society has completely been crushed. And look, this is not just a Tanzanian story. It's a cautionary tale for the entire continent. Because the playbook used here, the facade of reform and the capture of institutions, the legalistic removal of opposition, and the final brutal crackdown of aspiring autocrats all over the region would be studying that very closely. It shows just how fragile democracy in Africa is. And that when people are denied a voice at the ballot box, they will eventually seek one in the streets. But setting all that aside, perhaps the most important lesson is in the resilience of the Tanzanian people. Because despite the arrests, the violence, and the overwhelming power of the state, They did not stay silent. They took to the streets. They demanded to be heard. And that spirit of defiance, that refusal to just accept the death of their democratic right without a fight, is a powerful reminder that the desire for freedom is a very, very difficult thing to extinguish. The question we started with was, how did it come to this? We've seen the answer: a gradual, calculated, and ruthless consolidation of power. But the question now that hangs over Tanzania and a lot of other African nations on the brink is a different one. When a people's democratic hopes are crushed, how long do they remain broken before they rise again? The Tanzanian experience offers a brutal and urgent set of lessons for nations like Kenya, whose robust 2010 constitution provides the framework, but requires constant vigilance to prevent the autocratic playbook from actually succeeding. The job is to make the constitutional promises real and to firewall them from the abuse of our politicians before the 2027 election. So lesson 1, fix the referee now. An election is only as good as its referee. The Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, or the IBC, must be credibly and functionally independent. This requires transparent appointments, secure results transmission, public tally portals, and auditable logs, and genuine space for both domestic and international observers. This is what the real Article 88 body should look like. And its independence must be a non-negotiable. Lesson 2, stop lawfare before it actually starts. Do not allow cybercrime, public order, or seditious laws to become bludgeons against dissent. The government must tighten the definition of these laws, require rigorous judicial oversight for digital searches, and most importantly, protect political and journalistic speech in actual practice. This is how Articles 33, which is the freedom of expression, and 34, the freedom of media, truly do their job. Lesson 3, protest policing must protect life first. The right to assembly, as recorded in Article 37, is fundamental. Authorities must ban live ammunition for crowd control, strictly codify the principles of necessity and proportionality, and genuinely empower bodies like IPOA to monitor election period policing in real time. De-escalation and safe routes must be prioritized over blanket bans and actual violence. Lesson 4, no conditional opposition rights. Code of conduct should civilize political competition, not exclude competitors. Administrative technicalities must never be used as a last-minute de facto disqualification to remove strong rivals from the ballot. Any major changes to the election laws, they must be completed and frozen well before polling day, giving Article 38 of political, which is the political rights, actual teeth. Lesson 5. Internet shutdowns are a red flag. The state should be barred by statute from network disruptions without a strict, publicly stated court order, clear time limits, and human rights impact statements. The ability to kill the internet is the ultimate authoritarian move to conduct abuses in the darkness. Without firm guardrails against this, Article 33 and 34 are just wall art. Or, like one of our presidents stated, newspapers used to wrap meat in a butchery. Lesson 6, shield the courts. When politics overheats, the judiciary is the last circuit breaker. Its independence must be absolute. The state must insulate the budget, tenure, and appointment process for judges so that rights do not evaporate when they are needed most to challenge executive overreach. Finally, lesson 7, build civic muscle memory. A politically aware citizenry is the best defense. There must be sustained nationwide investment in civic education, the publication of plain language election rules, and the scaling up of independent non-partisan observation is important. The time to learn the rules is always before and not after the game has begun. This story of Tanzania's crushed hope is not just a warning. It's a profound lesson, and a lesson in fragility of freedom. The chilling 98% landslide was not just a result of the state's violence. It was a result of a calculated, incremental erosion of democratic process while the world and many citizens watched. The men and women who stood up to the repression in the streets of Dar es Salaam, who faced tear gas and bullets to demand a voice, paid the ultimate price for our shared basic right to choose our leaders. We owe their sacrifice a commitment to an eternal vigilance. The most powerful weapon against the creeping darkness of authoritarianism is not a protest in the streets, but the actions that we hold at the polls. You have a magnificent, hard-won constitution, but a constitution is just a piece of paper until you and I, all of us, collectively give it life. So, do not wait until the political weather turns foul. Do not let the apathy of the silent accomplish the death of democracy. The call is simple, personal, and urgent. Register to vote. Secure your voice. Secure your right. And secure the future of this great republic. Be the firewall. Be the guardian. As always, stay vigilant, stay registered, but most of all, stay ready. At the recording of this, I've just realized that our head of state has gone ahead to congratulate the incumbent. This should serve as fair warning to all of us Kenyans that regardless of the illegitimate process that Tanzania went through, that our leaders do not hold any moral compass and do not see the cry of their citizens. So again, I remind you, talk about this. Remind your friends, remind your relatives, everybody to register to vote, because our options can only be won at the ballot. A changed Kenya, a better Kenya is available if all of us actually do our part and cast a vote for the right people, and not because of their tribe, not because of where they come from or how much they've paid, but because of their love for this great nation of Kenya. I've been your host, DY. Again, asante for your continual support. May God bless you guys, and God bless our country. Till next episode, asanteni.
Ndugu zangu, wote tunaitakia mema nchi hii, tumesikitishwa na kuhuzunishwa na matukio ya uvunjifu wa amani, upotevu wa maisha na uharibifu wa mali za umma na mali za watu binafsi kwenye baadhi ya maeneo hapa nchini, hasa kwenye majiji na miji. Kilichotokea hakiendani na taswira na sifa za Kitanzania na sio Utanzania. Haikutushangaza kuona kuwa baadhi ya vijana waliokamatwa kutokana na kadhia hiyo wametoka nje ya Tanzania.